Welcome to Unlocking High Performance, a podcast for leaders who believe results should never come at the expense of their people. I'm Jason Lauritsen, an advisor to CEOs and leadership teams who want to accelerate performance without burning people out. Now, today, we're going to talk about what to do about your brilliant jerks. You know, those employees who are high performing, but probably more trouble than they're worth. And I got to thinking about this actually a couple weeks ago. My oldest son is in his 20s. He is going to school and he's working at a restaurant. And the reality is he's at that point where he's seeing the finish line. He's been working in the restaurant business for a long time and he's burnt out. He's ready for it to be over, but he's not quite to where he can quit. And so he came home one day and he was sort of telling me this story about something that he had done at work and sort of an injustice that he thought had happened, something, the managers had made some kind of change to a process that he did not appreciate. And so he took it on himself to sort of adjust this. He made changed something that the managers had done or assigned. He just decided he was going to change it. And so he did. And this caused the managers to, of course, not be very happy. And there was, kind of a freak out. And then he got really indignant and angry about this. And here's the thing is he's an exceptional employee for them. He is their best server. He is their most reliable server. He's been with them a long time. Historically, he's had a great relationship and they have loved him, but, as he's telling me the story, I was listening to this and I said, Dylan, I think you might be becoming, what we call in my business, the brilliant jerk. And I said, you need to be really careful. And so I proceeded to kind of explain to him that one of the most prickly challenges to deal with as a manager or a leader is to deal with someone who's a really high-performing employee, but who has, for whatever reason, become high maintenance, has become problematic, has started to create chaos or create more issues than they're worth, maybe. And I said, at some point, if you aren't careful, they're going to decide that your shenanigans are more disruptive than your reliability and the quality of your work, and you're going to find yourself looking for another job. And so we had this conversation and kind of talked through it, and he recognized that it was just his frustration spilling over, and he decided to kind of take some action to get himself back on track. And so I feel like I did those managers a favor, but that's a podcast for a different day maybe. But it got me thinking about this because this is a topic that I think is one of the most, like I said, one of the most challenging topics or one of the most challenging issues for the CEOs that I have worked with over the years. Like almost universally, this is something that they have struggled with. They have this brilliant jerk, and they're not sure quite what to do with them, and generally end up regretting how they handle it in the end. And here's the problem with brilliant jerks. This is what makes this complicated, is that usually it's an individual within your organization or on your team who is legitimately a high performer, right? It might be your very best salesperson. It might be someone who's leading a team or a project team that has produced really great work in the past. It might be someone on your senior leadership team, right? These are sometimes the most challenging. And I think the trap that most leaders fall into here is that they convince themselves that because of this high performance, because this person is such a valuable contributor from just a pure performance perspective, output perspective, they can't live without them. Right? They see the high performance and they know how valuable that is, but they can't see all of the other stuff, right? That high performance basically clouds their vision of all the other things that are happening around them, right? And so a lot of times these leaders kind of feel almost like they're trapped, almost like they're held hostage by this person. Now, when you dig below the surface, we know, because if you've worked with one of these people, and almost everyone has, the reality is that, these brilliant jerks, sure, they produce a ton of performance, but there's oftentimes so much damage being done around them, or, noise, drama, chaos, all kinds of things, that they've become really expensive in different ways. And so I think this is particularly true. And the ones that I think, CEOs that I have worked with struggle with the most is when these are executive leaders, right? These are senior leaders that sit at the big table, and they've maybe they've been around for a while, and they have, like I said, they've led teams that have produced some great performance, or maybe they've been there for some, kind of big moments where they really showed up. But now they've become a brilliant jerk, right? They're creating issues. And in almost every case, when this happens, when you have that senior leader brilliant jerk, the CEO kind of delays taking action because they decide that, or they almost convince themselves that doing so would be catastrophic, right? How would we replace them, right? What would we do? It would leave this big gap. But then once they finally take action, which is usually the person exiting the organization in one way or another, they then, sort of only after they're gone, they feel like they can see all that damage, right? That's when it becomes visible. And usually there's a lot of damage, right? There's a lot more than they even thought, because that damage is hard to see. It's also hard to quantify while it's happening, because, brilliant jerks tend to be really disruptive to a team. The functioning, particularly of the executive team, like over time, what happens is, if they're overly confrontational, or maybe they just are, like I said, their behavior is rude or dismissive, there's certain voices on the team that tend to start to check out, right? They just don't engage. They start avoiding that person. And because they're avoiding that person, that means decisions get harder to make, right? Decisions slow down at that level, which has pretty important ripple effects on the organization. Your ability to move quickly slows down because you've got some dysfunction at the top of the team. And it looks like team dysfunction when in actuality, it's one person kind of creating that chaos that's disrupting the team. A lot of times, these individuals too, while they might be at the head of a team that looks like a high-performing team, almost always those teams are actually underperforming their potential. They've got this really great team, and this isn't always the case, but it's often the case that once that leader is out of the way, there's leaders underneath that will elevate, and then the whole team kind of elevates once that behavior is removed, because they're having to absorb all of that behavior and disruption. And so that often, once that decision is made, sort of instead of it disrupting the team actually rises to sort of beyond even the level of performance in the past, because now they don't have that noise and interference at the top. And the morale damage of these brilliant jerks is known and seen. Like usually that's kind of where it starts to show up, or you start to feel it, but that morale damage sort of ripples all over the place. And when it ripples, especially within their team or people that this individual works with a lot, I mean, you lose people. And sometimes, they leave, and they're not saying they're leaving because this person is a jerk or an a-hole. They're leaving, they'll say it's because of another job. And sometimes you can miss the fact that you're losing great people, or that people stay and they just disengage. They're not playing up to their potential. So there's a ton of damage happening. And so this sort of leads to, the pattern that I see over and over and over, and I've seen this, it's predictable, sadly predictable. Is that when CEOs are in this situation, particularly with senior leaders who are brilliant jerks, they take a long time to confront the jerk, right? Because of all the stories, because they're worried about the impact, because of they're worried about the catastrophe, they take too long. And they wait until it's sort of no longer possible to avoid it, right? Something happens, or the organization is stuck or stalled or can't move or something's happening, they have to confront it, right? Something happens that they have to confront it. So they finally take action. And generally, that means the person exits or they have to forcibly sort of exit them. But then on the other side, here's what happens is all of those worst case fears, right? The catastrophe or what are we going to do without that performance never materializes. It's like when you pull that, it's like cutting out sort of a cancerous piece of the tissue. And if you get it all, then the tissue around it, the healthy tissue kind of like fills the gaps in and then the system becomes healthier because you've removed this thing that was making it ill. And ultimately at the end of it, after they do it, after they then see what happens afterwards, they always say the exact same thing. And it is this: I wish I hadn't waited so long. I wish I hadn't waited so long. Every time. So if you have a brilliant jerk on your team, in your organization, the most important thing you can do is take action now. Do something about it to confront it, because all of that cost is happening, whether you can see it or whether you might be unwillingly sort of not seeing, or sort of willingly, I guess, not seeing it, leaving it in your blind spot because it is uncomfortable to deal with. But that's your job. Right? That's why you have the role you have. And so here's what you do. It's pretty straightforward. The first thing, and I think this is an important step to not skip over, is to really take a minute to get clear about what exactly it is that's sort of making them a jerk. Like, what is the impact? What's the behavior? How are they showing up that's causing issues? Like, do some investigation to get really clear on that, so that because you need to be able to see that. Because then the next step is you need to confront that behavior, and that's having the conversation. It's going to be an awkward conversation. It's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but you need to confront the behavior directly, and you need to be very clear. And this is why you have to do step one about the specific behavior that's problematic. You have to be very clear about setting expectations for how you expect that behavior to change. Those expectations need to be in writing. You need to put in writing what's unacceptable, what is expected, what the timeline is on your expectations for change. You might, and I'm making a big assumption here that you've had some conversations with them in the past, right? That generally these brilliant jerks, this sort of happens over time, and you've probably tried to have some different conversations and were hopeful that some things would change. And you're now at a point where it's like, boy, we need to do something. Now, if you have not had that conversation, then, the first conversation is probably having more of a feedback conversation with them about what you're observing and what it's causing, and sort of inviting them to reflect on it and seeing if you can kind of coach them through some behavior changes. I'm assuming that you've done that if you're at the point that you're taking these actions. But if you have done the coaching, then and it's not changing, and you're kind of at that point where it's like, we have to do something about this. This is a change, or we have to take some pretty serious action. This is the step. You need to get it in writing, make sure there's a clear timeline on your expectation for change. And you also need to make very clear that there are consequences if the change doesn't happen. That should be in writing. Right? As I mentioned earlier, in writing, because that way it signals, number one, it helps with clarity to make sure they get it. But number two, it signals that you are serious. And then I think it's see what happens, right? Watch the behavior. And if you don't see some pretty significant, immediate signals that the behavior is going to change, then you need to take some action. Right? Give them a dignified exit, invite them to go have a restart or a start over someplace else, because maybe, who knows what's going on or why they've ended up here. But if they're not willing to change, then it's time for action. And I know this sounds hard and it sounds unpleasant, and both of those things may very well be true, but it's also maybe one of the most important things that you can do to really lead your organization forward towards accelerated growth. Because, like I said, the ripple effects of these brilliant jerks are often, like I said, they're just hard to see and quantify, and you'll see it very clearly after they're gone. You'll start to hear about it. You'll start to notice it. And part of the way that you'll notice it is that the organization will accelerate. It's kind of like flooding oxygen back into the room, right? Everybody feels energy. Everybody feels like, oh, it's finally over, is often the feeling that happens. And so I guess the last thing I would say is that when you think about this, part of the reason you put it off is sort of like, I can deal with this, right? You think about this as, you're the CEO, you're the leader. It's like you can deal with this. You'll keep trying to manage it. But what you're forgetting is that if you are struggling with them and you're their boss, imagine how much struggle someone, the people that report to them or the people that have to work with them regularly are likely having, and they have no leverage, right? They're probably on their best behavior with you. Imagine what might be happening to them. Do it for them, right? They are counting on you to do something. They're waiting for you to do something, right? Take action for them. They will thank you for it with their performance. So that's what I had for you today. That's how you deal with your brilliant jerks. And then hopefully you can avoid hiring them in the future, but that's sometimes unavoidable. So when you get one, don't avoid it. Take action right away. Don't let it linger because it's really costly to the organization. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you can take something from this conversation and use it to help both your people and your organization to thrive. I'll see you next time.